Her family kept her hidden from the world, until the Mafia boss found out. Why for 19 years? The east wing of the Whitlock estate had exactly one rule. The curtains never opened past 4 in the afternoon, and no guest was ever, under any circumstance, allowed past the second-floor landing. The staff called it Miss Adeline's wing, in whispers, the way people talk about a room they've been told not to ask questions about. The family called it something else entirely. They called it kindness. They said the girl who lived behind that locked door was fragile, difficult, better off unseen, and for 19 years, the world outside believed them. Nobody thought to ask what a locked door was actually protecting. Not until the night a dangerous man walked into the Whitlock mansion looking for a business deal, and left with a secret that would burn 2 empires to the ground. Adeline Whitlock had not seen the ocean in 11 years, though she could hear it. Her window, on clear nights, let in a thin ribbon of salt air from the cliffs a mile beyond the estate's east lawn, and she had learned to measure the seasons by the way that air changed. Colder and sharper in winter, soft and green-smelling in spring. It was, she sometimes thought, the only honest thing left to her. Everything else in her life came filtered through a door. She was 24 years old. She had been homeschooled by a rotating cast of tutors who were paid well and told little. Had never attended a single school dance, birthday party, or family funeral that involved anyone outside the estate's gates, and had not, in more than a decade, been introduced to a single person her family did not already control. She knew the shape of her own loneliness, the way other people knew the shape of their own hands, so intimately that she'd stopped noticing it as loneliness at all. It had simply become the architecture of her life. Her stepfather, Desmond Whitlock, called it protection. He had been saying that word to her since she was 13, in the same patient, regretful voice, as if he hated the necessity of it as much as she did. The world isn't safe for a girl like you, Adeline. You have to trust me. Her Aunt Constance, who managed the household with the brisk cruelty of a woman who had never once been told no, put it more plainly, usually after a glass of wine. You embarrass his family, sweetheart. It's better this way, for everyone. Adeline had spent years trying to work out what, exactly, about her required a locked door and a rotation of quiet, well-paid staff who never looked her fully in the eye. She wasn't unstable. She wasn't violent. She had a slight limp from a childhood injury that had never quite healed right, and she'd put on weight in the years of confinement that came from a body given nothing to do but wait. But neither of those things, she knew, explained the depth of what had been built around her. The cameras in the hallway outside her door, the specific instruction that she never be photographed, the fact that no picture of her existed publicly after the age of 11. She had asked, once, when she was 17, why there were no photographs of her mother anywhere in the house. Desmond's face had done something strange and controlled, like a man closing a drawer very carefully so nothing inside it would rattle. Your mother died young, he'd said. It's painful for the family. Let's not bring her up. Adeline had let it go, because she had learned, the hard way, that questions in that house did not get answered. They got punished, quietly, elegantly, in ways that never left a mark anyone outside the family would notice. A cancelled outing, a locked door that stayed locked an extra week, a tutor suddenly, mysteriously replaced. So she had stopped asking. She read instead. She had a library that took up half of her wing. Desmond, to his strange credit, never restricted her books, and she had built a private universe inside her head out of maps she'd never walk in cities she'd never see. She painted, badly at first, and then with real skill, using a set of oils Constance had allowed her as a Christmas gift one year, likely to keep her quiet rather than out of any real generosity. She talked to the housekeeper, a soft-spoken older woman named Marta, who was the only person in the house who ever looked at Adeline like she was a whole person and not a problem to be managed. And she waited. Though she could not have told anyone, not even herself, exactly what she was waiting for. The night everything changed, the Whitlock estate was hosting what Desmond called a small private dinner, the kind of small private dinner that required 4 extra staff, a caterer flown in from the city, and enough security in dark suits stationed around the property that the local police had been quietly informed not to send patrols down that stretch of coastal road until morning. Adeline knew about the dinner only because Marta had mentioned it while bringing up her evening tray. In the careful, sideways way Marta always shared information she wasn't supposed to share. Big names tonight, Marta had said, setting down the tray without meeting Adeline's eyes, a habit born of the cameras that watched the hallway, and, presumably, listened too. Mr. Whitlock's very anxious about it. Told Constance twice to make sure the East Wing stayed dark. When has it ever not been dark? Adeline said, and Marta's mouth had twitched, not quite a smile, but close. What neither of them knew, what nobody in the house knew, not even Desmond, who believed himself far too careful a man to be caught off guard, was that one of the 4 extra staff hired through the catering company that night was not, in fact, a caterer. His name, on the paperwork the agency had filed, was Adrian Cole. It was not his real name. His real name was known, feared, more accurately, throughout 3 states and half a continent's worth of shipping routes, casinos, and quietly owned real estate portfolios that never quite showed up under his name on paper. Adrian Vane ran an empire that had swallowed 3 smaller organizations in the last 5 years without ever firing a shot that made the news, because Adrian Vane did not believe in mess. He believed in leverage, patience, and information. And lately, he had begun to suspect that Desmond Whitlock, a man he had done 2 mutually profitable but carefully arm's-length deals with over the past year, was not entirely who he claimed to be. It had started with money. Adrian's people were meticulous, and meticulous people notice patterns. A shell account here, a property purchase there, funds moving through Whitlock's export business in amounts that didn't track with the volume of goods actually being exported. It was the kind of laundering pattern Adrian recognized because, in another life, he'd built structures just like it himself. But this wasn't his money, which meant somebody else's dirty funds were running through Desmond Whitlock's clean-looking business. And Adrian did not like operating next to men whose books he couldn't fully read. So he had come tonight not to eat canapes and discuss export tariffs, but to walk the house, to see what a man like Desmond Whitlock kept behind closed doors, because men who lied about their money usually lied about other things too, and Adrian had learned, over 15 brutal years of building his own name into something the underworld said carefully, that the truth about a man was rarely in his ledgers. It was in the rooms he didn't want you to see. He wore the black and white uniform of the catering staff like a costume that fit him too well, moved through the kitchen and the service hallways with the unhurried confidence of a man who had spent years learning how to disappear inside plain sight, and by 10:30 that night, while Desmond Whitlock stood in the drawing room charming 3 men who did not deserve to be charmed, Adrian Vane slipped up the back service stairs toward the one part of the house nobody had mentioned during the very thorough walkthrough his people had done that afternoon, the East Wing. There had been a door on the house blueprints his team had pulled. Public record, easily obtained. That simply wasn't accounted for in any of the tour Desmond's assistant had given the staff. A second-floor corridor, sealed off, no listed purpose. In Adrian's experience, unlisted purposes were the only ones worth knowing. The hallway, when he found it, was dim, a single low lamp burning at the far end, thick carpet swallowing his footsteps, 2 cameras mounted at angles that suggested whoever installed them had cared more about watching the door than watching the room beyond it. Adrian had disabled 2 cameras tonight already, out of habit. The same quiet muscle memory that let him walk into rooms he wasn't invited to without leaving a trace that he'd been there. He disabled these too. There was a door at the end of the hall, heavy, older than the rest of the house's renovated interior, with a lock on the outside, not the inside. Adrian stood in front of it for a long moment, understanding exactly what he was looking at, even before he heard the sound. It was music. Soft, almost inaudible. Coming from beneath the door, someone humming, off-key and unself-conscious, the kind of humming a person only does when they believe absolutely no one is listening. Adrian Vane had broken into more rooms than he could count in his life. Vaults, safe houses, the private offices of men who thought their money made them untouchable. He had never, not once, felt the particular cold that moved through him now, standing outside a locked door in a rich man's house. Listening to a woman hum to herself in a room she could not leave. He picked the lock in under a minute. It wasn't hard. Whatever this door was meant to keep contained, it had never been built to withstand someone who actually wanted in. The room beyond it was not what he expected. He had braced, without quite admitting it to himself, for something out of a nightmare. Chains, filth, cruelty with a face. Instead, he found a large, handsome bedroom with tall windows facing the sea. Shelves of books stacked 2 deep, canvases leaned against every wall in various states of completion. Soft lamplight, a woman sitting cross-legged on a window seat with a paintbrush forgotten in one hand, staring at him with an expression that took him a full 3 seconds to place, because he had never seen it aimed at him before. It wasn't fear. It was hope. "Are you real?" she asked. Adeline would think, later, that it was the strangest question she had ever asked anyone, and also the most honest thing she'd said out loud in years. The man standing in her doorway, tall, dark-haired, dressed in a caterer's uniform that didn't sit on him like a caterer's uniform should, with eyes that moved across the room cataloging every exit, every object with a precision she didn't yet understand. Looked at her for a long moment before he answered. "I'm real," he said. His voice was low, careful, the voice of a man deciding, in real time, how much of the truth a situation could bear. "Are you locked in here?" Adeline set down her paintbrush. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were not shaking, which surprised her. She had imagined this moment, a stranger, a door, a way out, so many times in so many forms that the reality of it felt almost anticlimactic, like her body had already used up its fear on the version that only existed in her head. "Every night," she said, "from the outside. There's a code, but I don't know it. I've never known it." "How long?" "Since I was 13. She watched his face for the reaction. Pity. Usually, on the rare occasion anyone learned even a fraction of the truth about her life, or worse, disbelief, the particular insult of being told her own experience wasn't real. He gave her neither. His jaw tightened, once, and something in his eyes went very still and very cold, but he didn't look away from her, and he didn't look at her like she was broken. "Why?" he asked. "I don't know," Adeline said. And it was, she realized as she said it, the truest sentence she had spoken in over a decade. "I've never known why. They tell me it's for my protection. My aunt says I embarrass the family. Nobody has ever given me a reason that made sense, and after a while, you stop expecting one." Adrian crossed the room slowly, the way a person moves toward an animal they don't want to startle, and crouched down near the window seat so he wasn't standing over her. Up close. She could see the calculation behind his eyes hadn't stopped. He was still cataloging, still working something out, but there was something else there now too, something that looked almost like anger on her behalf, which was a thing Adeline had genuinely never seen another human being direct at her situation before. "My name is Adrian," he said. "I'm not actually catering staff." "I gathered." The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. "I do business with your stepfather. Or I thought I did. Tonight I came to find out what kind of man I was actually dealing with." He glanced around the room again. The paintings, the books, the window that looked out over a sea she clearly hadn't touched in years. "I think I just found out." "Are you going to tell someone?" Adeline asked, and hated how small her voice sounded asking it, hated the flare of pure animal panic that came with the question, because if this stranger walked back downstairs and said nothing, if he simply closed the door behind him and let the house swallow this moment whole the way it had swallowed every other moment of her life, she didn't know if she could survive it. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. "I'm gonna get you out of this house," he said. "Tonight. And then I'm gonna find out exactly why your family has spent over a decade hiding you, because men like Desmond Whitlock don't build a cage this careful for no reason. There's something behind that door besides you, Adeline. I intend to find out what it is. You know my name. It's on the property deed for this wing," Adrian said, "filed under a private trust, along with your mother's name, Eleanor Whitlock." He watched her face carefully as he said it. "Does that name mean anything to you?" Adeline's chest went tight. "She died when I was small. Car accident. Nobody talks about her. There isn't a single photograph of her left in this house. I checked. Once, when I was younger, before they caught me looking and locked the library for a month. There's a reason for that too," Adrian said quietly, and something in his voice told Adeline that whatever he already suspected, he wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, not until he was certain. "Get your coat. Whatever you can carry quickly. We're leaving tonight, and we're not coming back until I understand exactly what your family has been protecting themselves from." Getting Adeline out of the house without triggering the alarm on the East Wing corridor took Adrian 11 careful minutes. Bypassing a keypad, rerouting a camera feed through a burner tablet his security chief had built for exactly this kind of improvisation. Guiding a woman who hadn't walked further than the length of her own hallway in over a decade down a back staircase she'd never known existed. Adeline's legs shook by the third flight. Not from fear, but from simple disuse, muscles that had never been asked to carry her this far this fast, and Adrian slowed his pace without comment, without making her feel the weakness of it, which was its own kind of unfamiliar mercy. They left through the same service entrance the catering trucks used. Adeline wrapped in a plain black coat one of Adrian's men produced without question, and by the time Desmond Whitlock's dinner guests were finishing their second course, his stepdaughter was in the back of an armored car, watching the gates of the only home she'd ever known disappear behind her for the first time in 11 years. She didn't cry. She had expected to, had imagined, in the fantasies she allowed herself late at night, sobbing with relief the moment freedom actually arrived. Instead, she simply watched the road, silent, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if she didn't yet trust the world enough to react to it. "You're quiet," Adrian said, watching her from across the car. "I don't know what the outside feels like yet," Adeline said. "I'm waiting to find out if it's safe to feel anything." Adrian didn't answer that, not right away, and Adeline appreciated it. The silence, the absence of some hollow reassurance that everything would be fine now. Spoken by a man who had known her for less than an hour and had no way of promising any such thing. Instead, he reached into his jacket and produced a slim folder, the kind of thing Adeline recognized, even in her limited experience of the world, as a dossier. "While you get settled, I'm going to have my people dig into everything about Eleanor Whitlock," he said. "Her death, her marriage to Desmond, what happened in the years before you were locked away. I think the answer to why your family hid you isn't really about you at all, Adeline. I think it's about her. You keep saying her name like it means something to you." Adrian's expression flickered, something old and controlled crossing his face, the way a man's face moves when a wound he thought had scarred over gets pressed unexpectedly. "It might," he said. "There was a woman named Eleanor connected to a rival organization years before your stepfather ever entered the picture. A woman who disappeared from that world overnight, along with a great deal of information certain people would have killed to keep buried. If your mother is the same Eleanor I'm thinking of, then your family isn't hiding you because you embarrassed them, Adeline. They're hiding you because you're the only loose thread left in a story a lot of very dangerous people would prefer stayed finished." The safe house Adrian took her to was nothing like the estate, a converted warehouse loft in the city. All exposed brick and steel beams, security discreet enough that Adeline didn't notice the cameras until her third day there, when a woman named Priya, quiet and efficient, walked her through the building systems with the patient thoroughness of someone briefing a person who had never had to think about her own safety before, because someone else had always been thinking about it for her, for reasons Adeline was only now beginning to understand had nothing to do with love. She slept 11 hours that first night, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that comes only when a body finally believes, on some cellular level, that it can stop being afraid. She woke to sunlight coming through windows that had no bars, no cameras aimed only at her, no schedule dictating when the curtains could open, and she lay there for a long time simply breathing, testing the strange new sensation of a morning that belonged entirely to her. Adrian was already awake when she came downstairs. Seated at a long table covered in papers, a laptop open beside a cup of coffee that had clearly gone cold an hour ago. He looked up when she entered, and something in his face, tired, focused, carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who'd been awake all night chasing a truth he suspected would be ugly, softened slightly at the sight of her. "You slept," he said. "I don't remember the last time I slept that well. Sit. I found something." He turned the laptop toward her, and Adeline felt her stomach drop before she'd even fully processed the image on the screen. A woman, young, dark-haired, standing beside a much younger Desmond Whitlock in a photograph that looked decades old, both of them smiling for a camera at what appeared to be some kind of gala. "That's her," Adeline whispered. "That's my mother. There are no pictures of her in the house. I didn't even know what she looked like. Her name, before she married your stepfather, was Eleanor Marchetti," Adrian said quietly. "She wasn't just a woman Desmond fell in love with, Adeline. She was the daughter of Salvatore Marchetti, one of the last independent bosses on the East Coast before his organization was wiped out in a war that most people in my world still talk about carefully 25 years later. Your mother wasn't supposed to survive that war. Officially, she didn't. There's a death certificate for Eleanor Marchetti dated 3 months before your mother married Desmond Whitlock under a name that wasn't hers." Adeline stared at the photograph, at her mother's smiling, unguarded face, and felt something crack open in her chest that she didn't have words for yet. She was hiding from the people who destroyed her family. "I think so," Adrian said. "And I think Desmond Whitlock knew exactly who she was when he married her. I think he used her father's remaining assets, contacts, information that never got destroyed with the rest of the Marchetti organization to build the empire he has now. Your family's export business, Adeline, the one I've been quietly investigating for the last 6 months, I think a significant portion of its foundation was built on money and connections that belonged to your mother's family. Money that was never legally his to use. And me?" Adeline's voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. "Where do I fit into this?" Adrian's jaw tightened. "You're Salvatore Marchetti's granddaughter, the last living blood heir to an organization that a lot of very old, very dangerous men spent a war trying to erase completely. If the wrong people ever learned you existed, learned that Eleanor Marchetti hadn't actually died, that she'd had a daughter who was still alive and still, technically, held a bloodline claim to territory and assets that were divided up among the men who destroyed her father 25 years ago. You wouldn't just be an inconvenience to Desmond Whitlock, you'd be a target to him and to everyone who profited from your grandfather's death. Adeline sat back slowly, the pieces of her entire life rearranging themselves with a violence that left her almost breathless. 19 years of locked doors, of no photographs, of a stepfather who called isolation protection and an aunt who called it kindness, while she'd actually been counting on Adeline never learning enough about herself to become dangerous to anyone. They weren't protecting me, she said slowly. They were protecting the money. My mother's money. His empire. If I disappeared into the world and someone recognized me, recognized her, it would have exposed exactly how Desmond built everything he has. That's my read on it too, Adrian said. But there's something else. Something I only found this morning, buried in property records nobody was ever supposed to connect together. He pulled up another document, an old land deed, a name Adeline didn't recognize highlighted near the bottom. Your grandfather's territory. The actual physical assets, warehouses, shipping routes along the coast, weren't fully absorbed by the men who took over after the war. A portion of it was placed in a trust that could only be legally claimed by a direct blood descendant of Salvatore Marchetti, verified through a specific set of legal conditions that your mother, before she died, apparently set up herself. You're saying I own something. I'm saying you might be the rightful heir to a piece of territory currently worth more than Desmond Whitlock's entire visible business, Adrian said. Which means the moment anyone connected to that world learns you're alive, two things happen simultaneously. Desmond Whitlock's entire financial foundation becomes vulnerable to exposure and collapse. And you become the single most valuable, most dangerous person in a war that everyone thought ended 25 years ago. The knock at the safe house door came 4 days later, and it wasn't Adrian's people. Adeline had been sitting at the long table, sketching. An old habit resurrected in this strange new freedom, her hand moving over paper with a steadiness that surprised her. When Priya's voice came sharp and urgent through the building's intercom system, a tone Adeline had learned, in her short time here, meant something was badly wrong. We have a problem, Priya said, appearing in the doorway a moment later, phone pressed to her ear, her usual calm efficiency replaced by something tighter. Adrian, Desmond Whitlock, knows she's gone. And he's not alone. Adrian was already moving, crossing to the security monitors mounted along the far wall, and Adeline followed, her pulse climbing as she watched the grainy black and white feed from the building's exterior cameras. 3 black vehicles had pulled up outside, and stepping out of the lead car, flanked by men in dark suits who moved with the particular unhurried confidence of people who did violence for a living, was her stepfather. Beside him stood a man Adeline had never seen before, older, silver-haired, dressed with an understated elegance that somehow made him more unsettling than the armed men around him, his face calm in a way that reminded her, with a cold jolt, of the way Desmond's face had gone carefully still every time she'd asked about her mother. "Who is that?" Adeline whispered. Adrian's expression had gone hard and flat, the look of a man doing rapid, silent math. "That's Anton Reyes," he said. "One of the 3 men who split your grandfather's territory after the war. If Desmond brought him here personally, it means he's not just trying to get you back quietly. It means he's already told Reyes you exist. Probably to buy himself protection from whatever exposure I've been threatening him with. Which means Reyes now knows there's a living Marchetti heir who could legally challenge his claim to a piece of territory he's held for 25 years. So he wants me dead. He wants you controlled first," Adrian said. "Married off. Disappeared. Legally signed away. Whatever keeps that trust claim from ever being activated. Dead only becomes the answer if you become too dangerous to control." He turned to her, his eyes hard and steady in a way that, despite everything, made Adeline feel less afraid rather than more. "Which is exactly why we're not going to let that happen. Priya, get her to the lower level. I need to have a conversation with our guests." What followed was not the kind of confrontation Adeline had built in her imagination during a decade of locked doors. No gunfire, no shouted threats, nothing so simple. It was quieter than that, and somehow more frightening. Conducted in the warehouse's main room with Adeline watching from a monitor 2 floors below, her hands pressed flat against the cold steel table as she listened to her stepfather's voice for the first time since the night she'd disappeared from his house. "You have something that belongs to my family," Desmond said, his tone carrying the same practiced patience he'd always used on Adeline, as if he were the reasonable one in every room he ever occupied. "I have someone who belongs to herself," Adrian replied, "which is more than you ever gave her." Anton Reyes spoke next, his voice smooth, almost pleasant, the kind of voice that made the hair on Adeline's arms rise. "Mr. Vane, I understand you've recently become invested in a piece of ancient history that would be far better left buried. Salvatore Marchetti's granddaughter doesn't need to become a complication in either of our lives. I'm prepared to be generous about ensuring she stays comfortable and quiet, somewhere far from any conversation about old trusts and old territory." "She's not a complication," Adrian said. "She's a 24-year-old woman who spent 11 years locked in a room so the two of you could keep stealing from a dead man's estate without anyone asking inconvenient questions. I've spent the last 4 days reading through exactly how thoroughly you both benefited from erasing her existence. Desmond's export business, your continued hold on the coastal shipping routes, Reyes. Both of you built a very comfortable life on the assumption that Eleanor Marchetti's daughter would never learn who she was. And what exactly do you intend to do with that information?" Reyes asked, and there was something underneath the pleasant tone now, something with teeth. "That depends on what happens in the next 5 minutes, Adrian said. "You can walk out of this building and go back to pretending Adeline Whitlock doesn't exist, the same way you've been pretending for 25 years. Or you can push this, and I release everything I've found. The trust documents, the shell accounts, the shipping manifests that don't match the money moving through them, to every remaining organization who might be interested to learn that 2 of the men who profited most from Salvatore Marchetti's death have spent the last 2 decades quietly stealing from his estate while hiding his actual heir in a locked room. I don't think either of you wants that conversation to happen in public." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Adeline found herself holding her breath, watching the monitor, watching her stepfather's face do the careful math of a man realizing, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he had badly misjudged the danger he'd walked into. "This isn't finished," Desmond said finally, his voice tight. "No," Adrian agreed. "It isn't. But it's finished for tonight. Get out of my building." They left, but Adrian's face, when he came down to the lower level afterward, told Adeline that the danger hadn't passed, it had only shifted shape. "They're not going to let this go," he said, sitting across from her at the steel table, his exhaustion visible now that the performance for Desmond and Reyes was over. Reyes especially. Men like him don't survive 25 years at the top of that world by ignoring threats to what they've built. He's going to move against the trust claim, probably try to have it invalidated or challenged before you can ever formally activate it. And if that fails, he'll try something less legal. "So what do we do?" "We move first," Adrian said. "I have a lawyer. Someone who specializes in exactly this kind of inheritance dispute, someone with no ties to either Reyes or your stepfather. We build the case for your claim properly, publicly enough that killing you would create more problems for Reyes than it would solve. The safest thing for you, Adeline, isn't hiding, it's being seen, being known. A ghost is easy to erase. A recognized heir with documented legal standing and public awareness of her existence is a very different, very expensive problem to make disappear." Adeline looked down at her hands, at the paint still faintly staining her fingertips from the mural she'd started on the safe house's blank west wall 3 days ago, and felt something steady settle into her chest that she didn't fully recognize at first because she'd never had the chance to feel it before. Certainty. "Then let's do it," she said. "I spent 11 years being hidden because it was convenient for everyone except me. I'm not going back into a locked room, Adrian. Not for Desmond, not for Reyes, not for anyone. If being seen is what keeps me alive, then I want the whole world to see me." Something moved across Adrian's face. Pride, she thought, though it took her a moment to place the expression because nobody had ever looked at her that way before. "Then we're going to need a very good lawyer," he said, "and probably a very public gala." The gala took 6 weeks to arrange, and in that time, Adeline learned more about the world and about herself than she had in the previous decade combined. She learned that her grandfather, Salvatore Marchetti, had not been the monster the surviving families liked to claim, but a complicated man who had, according to the few old associates Adrian's people tracked down and carefully interviewed, genuinely tried to keep his daughter out of the family business entirely, sending her to boarding schools in Switzerland, encouraging her love of art and languages, hoping she'd build a life far away from the world that eventually swallowed him whole. Eleanor Marchetti had tried to do exactly that, until the war came for her family anyway, and she'd had to disappear to survive it, trading her name and her past for a quiet marriage to a man who, Adeline now understood with a grief that came late but came hard, had never loved her mother at all. He had simply recognized, correctly, exactly how valuable a frightened, hidden woman with a dead family's fortune behind her could be to a man patient enough to slowly absorb it. Adeline learned that her mother had died, not in the simple car accident she'd always been told, but from a heart condition that had gone untreated for years, likely worsened. According to old medical records Adrian's team quietly obtained, by the particular stress of a life spent in hiding, married to a man who had never once let her feel safe. And Adeline learned, slowly, carefully, in the weeks she spent working alongside Adrian's lawyer and his security team, and Priya, who became something like the first real friend Adeline had ever had, that the terror of stepping into the world after a lifetime of confinement did not simply vanish. It came in waves, sudden panic in crowded rooms, an instinct to apologize for taking up space that Adrian gently, repeatedly, refused to let her indulge, a lingering disbelief that any of this was real, and not some elaborate cruelty about to be snatched away. "You keep waiting for someone to lock the door again," Adrian said to her one evening, weeks into their work together, finding her standing at the loft's tall windows long after midnight, watching the city lights the way she used to watch the sea from her old room. "I don't know how to stop," Adeline admitted. "I've spent so long being told the world outside was dangerous, that I was the problem, that this," she gestured at the window, "the city, the whole enormous unknowable world beyond the glass, was something I had to be protected from. It's strange, unlearning that. Some mornings I still expect Constance to be standing at the end of the hallway." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth," he said finally, "I don't think you were ever the problem. I think you were the answer to a question your family desperately didn't want anyone asking. There's a difference." Adeline turned to look at him, this dangerous, careful, unexpectedly gentle man who had broken a lock off a door on a whim of suspicion, and ended up rebuilding her entire understanding of her own life. "You could have walked away," she said. "That first night. You could have found what you needed about Desmond's finances and just left. You didn't have to take me with you." "No," Adrian agreed. "I didn't have to." "Why did you?" He considered the question with the same careful weight he seemed to give everything, and when he answered, his voice had lost some of its usual careful control. "Because I've spent 15 years building an empire out of other people's fear," he said. "I know exactly what it looks like when someone has been made small on purpose, kept quiet on purpose, hidden on purpose, because their existence was inconvenient to someone more powerful. I've done versions of that myself, to men who deserved it, and men who probably didn't. I heard you humming to yourself in a locked room like you'd forgotten anyone was ever supposed to be listening, and I couldn't make myself walk away from that. I still can't." The space between them had closed without Adeline quite noticing it happen, and she found herself searching his face for the careful mask he wore for everyone else. Desmond, Heiress, his own men, and finding instead something unguarded, something that looked almost afraid. On a man she was fairly certain had not felt afraid of very much in a very long time. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted quietly. "Any of it. Being looked at. Being wanted. I spent so long being told I was a problem to be managed that I don't know what it feels like to just be a person someone actually chooses." "Then we'll learn together," Adrian said. "I've never exactly chosen someone before either. Not like this." When he kissed her, it wasn't the desperate, storm-driven collision she might have imagined in the fantasy she'd built during a decade of locked nights. It was slow, careful, a question asked with the same patience he'd shown her from the first moment he'd crouched down beside her window seat instead of standing over her. And Adeline understood, in that quiet space between one heartbeat and the next, that this was the first choice, entirely her own, that she had ever been allowed to make. The gala took place at a hotel in the city that Adrian's organization had quiet, extensive control over, though nothing about the evening's careful legality would ever suggest it. Adeline stood at the top of the grand staircase in a deep green gown that had been chosen for her by a stylist who actually asked her opinion, for the first time in her adult life, about what she wanted to wear, and looked down at a room full of lawyers, journalists, minor officials, and a scattering of people from Adrian's world who had come out of curiosity rather than loyalty, all of them waiting to hear the public announcement of a legal claim that would formally, unshakably establish Adeline Whitlock as the living, verified heir to a trust that predated most of them. Desmond had not come. Constance had not come. Adeline had expected the sting of that absence to hurt more than it did. Instead, standing at the top of those stairs with Adrian at her side, she felt only a kind of clean, uncomplicated relief. She had spent her entire life waiting for their approval, their permission, their explanation. She didn't need any of it anymore. Anton Reyes had come, and Adeline found him near the back of the room when the lawyer finished the formal announcement. The trust activated, the claim verified, the story of Salvatore Marchetti's granddaughter now attached permanently and publicly to her name in a way that made her, exactly as Adrian had predicted, far too visible and far too legally protected to simply disappear. Reyes's face, when their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, held none of the smooth pleasantness from their first encounter. What remained was something colder and considerably more honest. The look of a man recalculating a war he believed finished 25 years ago. He did not approach her. He did not need to. The message in his stillness was clear enough. This was not over, not entirely. And there would be negotiations and maneuvers still to come in the months ahead, over territory and money, and the complicated, dangerous business of an inheritance built on a war's wreckage. But Adeline was no longer a locked door away from any of it. She was standing in the light, in a room full of witnesses, wearing her mother's name for the first time in her life, with a man beside her who had chosen to see her rather than manage her, and for the first time since she was 13 years old. She understood, with absolute clarity, that whatever came next, she would face it as herself. 6 months later, the mural on the west wall of Adrian's loft, no longer just a safe house, but something closer to home, though Adeline had insisted on keeping her own studio in a building 3 blocks away, a small, stubborn insistence on independence that Adrian had never once tried to argue her out of, was nearly finished. It showed the sea, the way she remembered it from her window in the East Wing, but wilder now, closer, unbounded by any glass between her and the water. Marta had come to see it the week before, the first visit from anyone connected to the old estate that Adeline had allowed. The older woman had cried, standing in front of the painting, and told Adeline, in the careful sideways way she always shared things she probably wasn't supposed to, that Desmond's business had quietly collapsed under the weight of the exposure Adrian's lawyers had, in the end, only partially needed to release, that Constance had left the country, that the house on the cliff had already been sold. Adeline had listened to all of it with a strange, settled calm. It didn't feel like victory exactly. It felt like a door finally closing on a room she'd never needed to enter again. Adrian found her that evening on the loft's balcony. The city spread out below them in its endless, indifferent glitter, and wrapped his arms around her from behind the way he'd learned she liked. Solid, grounding, never pinning her in place, always leaving her the choice to step away if she wanted to. She never did. Rise made an offer today, he said quietly. Wants to negotiate territory boundaries instead of fighting the claim any further. My lawyer thinks it's a genuine olive branch. I think it means he's finally accepted you're not going anywhere. Good, Adeline said, and meant it, in a voice that no longer carried the small, apologetic quality it once had, back when she'd first learned to speak in a locked room where the only person who ever answered back was herself. I'm not. Below them, the city hummed with a million lives she'd once been told were too dangerous for her to touch. Adeline Marchetti breathed in the salt air drifting up faintly from the harbor, closed her eyes, and let herself feel, without flinching, without waiting for someone to lock a door behind her, the simple, enormous fact of being exactly where she wanted to be. If Adeline's journey from a locked room to claiming her own name had you hooked from the first scene, smash that like button and let us know in the comments what you think Anton Reyes really wants from that olive branch. Share this with anyone who loves a slow burn mafia romance with real stakes. And subscribe so you never miss the next dangerous secret we uncover.